Good evening, everybody. I'm Mark Trowbridge, the president of our Coral Gables Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to tonight's crowdcast featuring author Sasha Isenberg in conversation with Molly Ball. And let me also bring you greetings and happy Pride Month. On behalf of our Coral Gables Chamber of Commerce and the Miami-Dade Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, we are proud to be partners this evening with our good friends at Books and Books. For nearly 100 years, our chamber has served the greater Miami community. And for the past year, we have been engaged more openly and intentionally in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. This includes working closely with our member companies and their workforce to educate, inform, and advocate around issues impacting our LGBTQIA+ community. For the past 15 years, I have been an out and proud leader of our chamber, and I'm equally proud of our partnership with such leading community voices as Books and Books. Thank you to Mitchell Kaplan and Christina Nosti for being incredible conveners around such essential conversations like we have tonight regarding gay marriage. We are truly grateful to you. And so tonight, we will be discussing The Engagement, America's quarter-century struggle with same-sex marriage. And I have a copy of the book here, and I want to remind you there's a little green button right below where you see me right now where you can go and buy this great book that you're going to hear about in a couple of minutes. Every one of those purchases supports our friends at Books and Books. Independent bookstores need you now more than ever, as do all of our local businesses, so please make a purchase today. You may also engage with us by placing questions in the chat, and I will happily work with Molly to moderate those at the end of the discussion. And now on to our program. First, I want to welcome our author and featured speaker this evening, Sasha Isenberg. He is the author of 3 previous books, including The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. He has covered presidential elections as a national political reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe, a columnist for The Slate, and a contributor to Bloomberg Politics and Business Week. He is the Washington correspondent at Monocle, and his work has also appeared in New York, the New York Times Magazine, and George, where he served as a contributing editor. He also teaches in the political science department at the University of California at LA, or UCLA as we love to call it. And he will be joined tonight in moderation by Molly Ball. Molly is the national political correspondent for Time, covering campaigns, the White House, political personalities, and policy debates across America. She is also a frequent television and radio commentator. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Pelosi, a biography of the first woman Speaker of the House. Ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a treat this evening, so let's please welcome Sasha and Molly.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for coming and for your interest in this wonderful book. I heartily second what Mark said. You should absolutely read it, and more importantly, buy it. That's why we're really all here tonight. But I'm so excited to talk with my friend Sasha about a subject that we've both covered for many years, and that I learned so much that I didn't already know from this great book. So, Sasha, why don't you kick us off by just talking about what inspired you to write this book, how you got the idea, and what moved you to decide to write a book about it?
Thanks, Molly. So I first had the idea for this in 2011. I was working on a book called The Victory Lab, which Mark mentioned, which I was spending a lot of time talking to pollsters or people who studied public opinion in some form or another. And people repeatedly made a version of the same observation to me, which is that they had never seen opinion on a single issue move it the way that they had seen it move on marriage. And nobody really had a good explanation as to why that was. And that stuck with me when I saw the New York Senate vote to pass the Marriage Equality Act in New York, and Governor Cuomo signed it into law pretty quickly in the summer of 2011. It was the first time I was sort of convinced, as somebody who followed politics, who covered politics, that I had some sense of how this was going to end. That, I certainly didn't think it would happen as quickly and with as little friction as it did, but it sort of seemed to me that there's only one trajectory that this issue was going to take. And people were already starting to talk about it as the defining sort of civil rights movement of of our time. The entirety of it had taken place during the years when I was alive, and nobody had ever sort of put together the story of where this came from and how it sort of came to consume our politics, and how we ended up reaching what, obviously over the course of the time I was working on the book became a national resolution to it.
Yeah, one of the things that is amazing that you really get the full force of in this narrative is how this issue sort of, I don't know, like an elephant moving through the digestive system of a boa constrictor, right? It sort of took over politics for many years, and then it was just gone. And you sort of write in the epilogue that it was as if it never happened. We just all decided to agree on this, with a few exceptions. It's really remarkable. What surprised you as you were reporting this book? What were the biggest things that either you had misconceptions about, or that you hadn't seen in the previous coverage of this?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is sort of the accidental origins of this cause. I think that there's a desire, as we think of it as one of the grand American social movements or civil rights breakthroughs, to assume that this had a sort of long, slow development, that there were people plotting it from the beginning. This is the way the stories of the suffrage movement are written, that in 1872, people were thinking about how you end up, taking this nationally. These are the stories of how school desegregation cases were written, that there was was a 40-year plan that was hatched of how you were going to end up with what became Brown v. Board. And so I think we have a natural desire to kind of retrofit that architecture onto these things, because we end up at a point where we see it as a matter of justice and equity, and then we assume it had to be inevitable. And if it's inevitable, you sort of assume that it had to have always been a sort of basic political and legal demand. And the fact is, it wasn't. My book starts in 1990, and there's basically no one in the United States who's like for or against same-sex marriage. There's, hardly a politician that's ever been asked about it. The major gay rights groups in the country have not declared it an objective. The major opponents of gay rights have not said it's something that they want to fight. It just doesn't exist as an issue in the way that we think of political issues. And, what I ended up finding, it was clear from the record of what had been written before that a case in Hawaii ends up being sort of transformative. And it was no secret that this Hawaii Supreme Court ruling in May of 1993 was important, because it was the first time that any court on earth had recognized that the fundamental right to marriage could extend to same-sex couples. And it was pretty clear that when the Defense of Marriage Act came before Congress in 1996 and was signed into law by Bill Clinton that year, that was very much a response to what had happened and could still happen in Hawaii. But nobody had ever, the big hole in the stuff I was reading was, it never made sense to me how this case in Hawaii started. We knew that there were 3 couples who went into the Honolulu office of the Hawaii Department of Public Health on December 17th, 1990, and request marriage licenses. And then eventually they get a lawyer who sues the state on their behalf. And then they end up prevailing at the Supreme Court 2 years later. But the hole in these stories was always, why did these couples request this marriage license? There wasn't a lawyer with them at the beginning. There was no legal strategy behind it. They didn't have an organization that was supporting them. And what I ended up uncovering was something that in certain ways was an inconvenient truth for civil rights groups, which is nobody had a plan. This was, the work of this guy named Bill Woods, who was the gay rights activist in Honolulu through the 70s and 80s. He was something of a gadfly. He was very good at getting attention. He was very good at creating things. He was not particularly good at working with others. He was not a lawyer. And he gets into this sort of petty rivalry in a pride planning committee, decides that to upstage a rival pride planning committee, he's going to put on a wedding, and basically misreads the state statute and assumes that these couples might actually be able to have their relationships recognized by the state, and then gets into another petty fight with the state affiliate of the ACLU, and to force their hand, brings these couples in as basically a PR stunt, thinking that that'll stop the ACLU from blowing him off. And this is not the story we tell about successful civil rights litigation. And so that's where the book starts. And that was really the biggest surprise for me. And it takes a few years before the sort of architecture, the infrastructure of our political debates organizes around this issue, but it wasn't being driven by interest groups or activists who had any real idea what they were getting into.
Yeah, Bill Woods is one of my favorite sort of undiscovered characters in this narrative because, as you said, there are a lot of political operatives who look back on this and want it to be a sort of neat, successful case study, right? They want it to be a template that you could apply to some other issue to make public opinion move 30 points in a decade and win your big battle. But it's clear from this book that the narrative is just way too messy and contingent for that to really be the case. And that, as much as I think a lot of the professional activists in this narrative would like to say, well, it was when we, all got together and developed a plan, but you have these disruptors like Woods or like Fred Karger, whose tactics are disavowed by a lot of people in the movement, but end up being extremely effective, particularly in sort of defunding the opposition. Or even when Ted Olson kind of cannonballs in at the end, right? He's sort of not on the same page strategically. In fact, you have the movement sort of feuding and at odds with each other right up to the very last court case. So it's also not the case that it was sort of the unity of the strategy that made it successful. Do you, though, draw any lessons or have activists and operatives reading this book drawn any lessons from the way that this came about that could be applied more broadly?
Yeah, so I do think that there are big, I think people want to make it a sort of tidier, neater, less messy history than it was, but that doesn't mean that there aren't sort of some significant lessons that can be taken away. And then I think other groups are trying, maybe overlearning some of these lessons. There's certain ways in which gay marriage is a different type of issue than other things. But one important thing that happens, there's a group which you've written about called Freedom to Marry, which gets formed in 2001 and sort of relaunched in 2009, and it has one specific goal, which is just what they call marriage equality in the 50 states and the District of Columbia, and makes very clear that once that is reached through whatever political or legal processes get them there, they're going to go out of business. And most political interest groups are not built around a particular goal. They're built around a coalition or an umbrella of issues and concerns, and they tend not to want to go away. And that means that they make all sorts of strategic and tactical decisions that don't necessarily foremost advance the goal, an issue goal, but exist to keep the organization going, to keep their donors happy, to keep relationships that they can use for other issues. And one of the things you see is some of the source of the kind of internal conflict within the gay and lesbian community is the groups like the Human Rights Campaign, most prominently, which had emerged in the 1980s, and by the mid-1990s had become moderately, somewhat successful in building relationships on Capitol Hill and the White House, mostly with Democrats, but also with some moderate Republicans. And they didn't want to go out and fight for marriage, which they did not think was gettable at any time soon and would jeopardize sort of, some of the small incremental gains that they were getting in other policy areas and possibly ruin relationships that they had worked hard to develop. And I think that was very logical from the perspective of HRC. It didn't make them particularly well loved among activists who thought that they were, too insidery, too compromising, not willing to fight. But it sort of made sense if their goals included conceivably, relationship recognition for gay and lesbian people. But like in the mid-90s, they were fighting to get the Justice Department to keep separate records about hate crimes that included gays and lesbians. And like that was something where you could get Republicans maybe to vote for you in the Senate, but you wouldn't get them to vote for something on marriage. And so they made a set of trade-offs, and the trade-offs are reasonable. And it took something like Freedom to Marry to come in and say, we have one goal. And we don't have to make we're going to make strategic decisions about where we go and what we do, but it's only going to be for the goal of marriage. We are not an umbrella group for the entire gay and lesbian or LGBT community. And I think that's really unusual. And they put themselves out of business after the Supreme Court ruled because they'd gotten their results. And I think that really allowed them to focus on this issue and do some really important research that changed the way that the political work on this issue was being done.
Do you think there was a downside to that strategy as well?
I mean, I think that there are a lot of people in the LGBT world who sort of rue the missed opportunities of marriage. Marriage came both by the sort of design of some people, some big donors in particular, and by some sort of accidents of history. And I think the fact that it's kind of culturally salient in a way that some other issues aren't, to dominate the LGBT issue agenda over the last couple of years. And, as things were, there are a lot of things that have not moved forward as a political or legal matter for parts of the LGBT community. I mean, the obvious thing that we now see are transgender people who are, functionally no better off as a result of the marriage advocacy than they were before. We should note that there are a lot of trans folks who were actually able to, just like bisexuals, able to marry the people that they loved, even when same-sex marriage was illegal where they lived. But that this was not an issue that necessarily brought together all parts of the coalition. And as things went to the Supreme Court in 2015, and it looked very likely, if not certain, that a majority would come together to strike down the existing state bans on same-sex marriage and thus rule that same-sex couples nationwide could marry, that there was sort of a question about, Anthony Kennedy ends up writing the majority opinion. And the question is, how big an opinion is it going to be? There's, and at that point, it's almost, people were almost taking for granted that they were going to win. And then it was, what does winning big look like? And winning big would have looked like an opinion that conceivably treated this as a major civil rights case that said that discrimination against sexual minorities should be treated under civil rights law equivalent to discrimination on the basis of race and sex and religion. Anthony Kennedy did not, and that would have been a major breakthrough for not just transgender and other queer folks, but for gays and lesbians who live in states where there are no non-discrimination laws, for example. But he ended up writing a very narrow decision that was about marriage. He treated this not as a civil rights case, barely as a gay rights case, and really as a marriage case about how special marriage is in America, and you shouldn't exclude people and disrespect the children that they have by denying them access into this institution. To some degree, that was a result of very successful messaging from gay rights activists about how and why gay people wanted to be part of this institution of marriage, not about anti-gay discrimination being a central problem. And so I think that there are a lot of people who look back and think that this was obviously a big victory for gay rights, but it could have been leveraged into a more sweeping victory for the LGBT community.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, as you point out, that before DOMA or any of this controversy really hit nationally, the gay rights movement was fighting for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And all these years later, they still are, although as you point out, the Bostock decision, which had some surprising conservative support on this now very conservative court, obviated it to some degree. What is the next frontier for gay rights and for LGBT rights more generally?
So I think you see two things that happen. One is, even before the Obergefell decision in 2015, there were a lot of religious conservatives who had been fighting against gay marriage, who basically acknowledged that this was lost, that, and there's sort of two things that came out of that. One is a real lurch towards fighting on transgender issues, which we now see kind of in full flower. But much of that, I think, was just moving to where public opinion remained on their side. I mean, you talk about the 30-point shift over the years in same-sex marriage, and opinion on a lot of trans issues are similar to where things were on marriage before. So part of it is going to a sort of a position of strength. But the other thing is that we've seen this push towards religious liberty, demanding religious liberty exemptions. And I think one way to look at that is a concession that unlike Roe v. Wade, where 50 years later, conservatives still have a very real hope of overturning it through the courts. There is nobody who's seriously talking about overturning Obergefell. I don't know anybody who thinks that there's a possibility that a case would even sort of get at the central holding of Obergefell, which is that you can restrict marriage to opposite sex couples. But what conservatives now want to do is basically carve out exemptions that could have the purpose of limiting what civil marriage means in our society by telling, institutions or employers that they can treat different types of married couples differently if that's in line with their religious values. And so there was a case that ended up not being decided on the merits. It got a lot of attention about a baker in your home state of Colorado who didn't want to make a wedding cake for a gay couple. There've been a lot of cases about like wedding photographers and florists and stuff like that. There's now a case that the Supreme Court is likely to decide later this month. It's a Catholic social service agency that doesn't want to place foster children with same-sex families. And I can imagine if the court starts, acknowledging various exemptions, maybe in a few years, we're looking at a case where, a private employer says that they will give health insurance coverage to the opposite sex married partners of their employees, but not to the same sex partners of their employees, because that interferes with the religious views of their owners or board or shareholders or whatever. And so I think we could end up in a place where we're not questioning whether gay people can get married, but whether society on a whole is obliged to treat their marriages interchangeably with those of straight couples.
I mean, as you recount in the book, the right almost had to be dragged into putting this on the plate of the culture war, right? There were a few sort of rank and file social conservative activists who had to kind of go out there and convince people that this was important. It was almost as if their hearts were never really in it. I think for myself at the time, it seemed like the central issue in the culture war. But then, as you say, no one is really still obsessed with this. Even Kim Davis seems to have moved on. So, I mean, do you think that this was a real as opposed to a manufactured outrage for large segments of the right?
I think the fear was sincere. I mean, so a lot of this just is not a real thing that people have to contend with until Massachusetts starts marrying same-sex couples in 2004. And I think people had a sincerely held sense that this is obviously a central institution, not just in society at large, but in almost everybody's individual lives. And that, this 6,000-year-old institution could be, if there's a dramatic change to our understanding of it, that could have societal implications. I think that was true. I think that a lot of that was just a fear of the new. I think it's like it's sort of a fundamental tenet of the conservative mind to fear dramatic social change, and this was a dramatic social change. What changes in May of 2004, once same-sex couples start marrying in Massachusetts, is that before that point, opponents can make these really apocalyptic statements about what would happen if we change this institution, and literally, this is going to be the end of Western civilization. Rick Santorum compares it to 9/11. It's a homeland security crisis. I mean, heavy stuff. After couples start marrying in Massachusetts, nobody can, even the biggest critics of same-sex marriage have trouble coming up with examples of what has actually changed and who has actually been harmed by this. And I think that ends up being a big problem for keeping together a coalition of people who are opposed to it, because very few people have a stake in a personal stake or economic stake in resisting marriage once it's already happening. And so what starts to happen over, I think, the decade between the Massachusetts, what happens in Massachusetts in 2004 when this comes to the Supreme Court, is that the coalition of people who are personally invested in same-sex marriage expands. Not just gays and lesbians who want to get married or are already married, but their families, their communities, often their employers who now have clarity over what type of benefit packages they should have. They don't have some expectation about who's going to be covered under various things. Unions that now can negotiate contracts and know what they're asking for on behalf of spouses, stuff like that. So that coalition is growing in favor of same-sex marriage with people who actually invested in this. And the coalition of people who are opposed to it shrinks because nobody's really bothered by the fact that gay couples are marrying. And so I think that sort of explains, not just the shift in public opinion, but the intensity of the opinion, that by the end, there's nobody who really cares a lot about fighting about this. And I think that, there are a lot of issues in our politics where this might be a dramatic one, but where some of the resistance is just something's new and unimaginable. And And the resistance comes from a sort of sincerely held sense of fear about what the change would entail. And then the change is either sometimes it's bad and sometimes it's not that bad. And then people have to kind of reorient to the reality of the new world we're living in.
Well, same-sex marriage ended up being perhaps surprisingly popular with gay people as well, right? I mean, there was, as you mentioned, this early debate about, well, is it not radical enough, or is it a betrayal of what we stand for to buy into this traditional small c conservative institution of marriage? And you still see echoes of that debate today, and you hear people sort of waxing nostalgic for the days when it was more inherently countercultural to be part of the gay rights movement. But it strikes me as a parallel for some of the political debates in other arenas where you have this activist, I don't want to call it a fringe, but you have a vocal core of activists staking out an extreme position, and then this rank and file sort of, silent majority of normie gays who actually do want to get married and behave like conservatives in their communities, right, with the white picket fence and so on and so forth. I mean, was that a development that people anticipated, or did that come as a bit of a surprise?
No, I think that was I think it did two separate things. One, I think you're absolutely right that there was just the material value. There have been people who been debating this as an abstraction. Is it desirable to seek acceptance into? It was often explicitly a feminist critique that was coming from lesbian lawyers and legal theorists, who had gone to college and law school, sort of in the era of second wave feminism, and they saw marriage as an institution that had been, created and perpetuated to subjugate women, and they said, as you put it well, we have created a sexual counterculture with its own mores and own values. Why should it be our goal to fight for, inclusion in this patriarchal institution, whatever? So I think there's an ideological opposition that goes away when religious conservatives decide that they're gonna fight this, and there is nothing that can organize a fragmented union, movement like your opponents deciding to go after you, and that to some degree that was a small strategic error by religious conservatives, that they actually took an issue on which the gay rights movement was fragmented and made it something that where they were united. But I think you're right that there's also the material value of marriage and individual lives, which is detached from the symbolic power of this. And there had been a push among many of these same sort of lesbian lawyers and legal theorists in the 80s to argue that the goal of LGBT family law should be often what they call multiple families. That the objective should be to create a legal regime where a wide spectrum of arrangements, household arrangements, were equally accepted under the law. So that could be, partnerships between people of different sexual combinations, but also multi-member households, single parents, co-parent adoption, communal living, the whole range. And the idea would be that all the rights and benefits under the law would accrue equally to people, regardless of how they set up their household. That goes away, that push. Even stuff like civil unions and domestic partnerships have basically disappeared from our conversation. Gays and lesbians have done more than straight people in the last generation to reaffirm marriage as the kind of central, both the legal gold standard and the kind of, only arrangement that in our society is expected to give a certain range of not just rights and benefits, but validation. But the rights and benefits are really important. And especially, you say sort of normie, I think that there's also a way in which, it gets treated as this kind of bourgeois. I think culturally, it does seem like a very sort of bourgeois mainstream ambition to be married, because we think of the white picket fences and the minivan and whatever. But really well-to-do people, or I should say, relatively well-to-do people, could hire lawyers to draw up contracts that could basically find their way to every one of the rights and benefits of marriage. Super wealthy people cared a lot about marriage because the estate tax, you can't contract your way out of an estate tax exemption. But working class gays and lesbians not in San Francisco or in New York, in places where, throughout the country, really saw the value of marriage, because like if you want to get on your spouse's union pension, there's only one way that that's going to happen. If you want to get dental coverage through a partner, there's only one way that that's going to happen. And I think people recognize that. And I think that some of the leadership in the gay and lesbian movement was taken aback by how popular this was among their kind of rank and file constituency.
Well, and as you allude to in the book, you also met and married your opposite sex spouse over the course of the time that you were working on this book. Did you feel like researching the subject taught you things about marriage? Yeah,
I mean, I had thought relatively little about marriage before I worked on this project. I had like a kind of generalized ambition to be married myself. My parents were married. I'd been around marriage, but I never really thought about what it was in society or what it represented. And, I'm in the odd position that most of my thinking about marriage has now been shaped by reading legal briefs and judicial opinions. But, there were some beautiful bits of writing in there. There's a line, I think it's in Margaret Marshall's opinion in the Massachusetts suit, where she said that marriage is the most momentous act of self-definition, I guess in a human being's life. And when I decided to marry my wife Amy, that was sort of bouncing around my head, and I would never have kind of thought about marriage in those terms. And I also very much, as a freelance writer and part-time academic, I very much benefit from some of the material benefits that come along with her employer-sponsored health insurance and things like that. But I think that one of the things that happens when you have both a legal effort and especially a legal effort, but a political effort, is that the sides started to have to explain what marriage was and why it was important. And some of that was a response to civil unions, right? I mean, like that in 2000, civil unions emerged in Vermont as this kind of compromise when a court says that you can't deny same-sex couples the equal benefits that straight couples have, but says to the legislature you don't actually have to give them marriage. And after that point, gradually, gay rights activists realized that they have to start explaining why marriage is special. And a lot of that language ends up being stuff that sort of resonated with me as a straight person and thinking about marriage. And it's one reason I think that some of these court decisions, the opinions, the Massachusetts one, Kennedy's and Obergefell, are now being read at weddings by like gay and straight couples, because it's kind of our public language about what this institution means now.
Yeah, I've definitely been to more than one straight wedding in addition to gay weddings where lines from various court decisions have been read, which is an interesting phenomenon. I'm going to open it up for questions in just after my next question or two. So if you're out there, please start thinking about what you want to ask. But the other thing that you mentioned that was sort of an innovation, perhaps a necessity by Freedom to Marry, was this combined political and legal strategy, right? This sort of two-track effort to move public opinion and win political campaigns, not as a means of accomplishing wholesale the change that they wanted, but mainly to sort of put pressure on the court and move to a place where the court would feel comfortable making this decision. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that came about?
Yeah, so I read about a strategy meeting that's held in the spring of 2005 by, I think it's 9 lawyers and strategists from sort of all of the major groups involved in gay rights work. And they have a few major donors behind them that want a sort of plan of how they're going to do this nationally. 2004 was a terrible year. The federal marriage amendment was introduced. It got majorities in both houses of Congress. I think 13 states end up passing statewide ballot amendments to ban marriage. And so there's a real reckoning. Basically, they're saying after 2004, if we're gonna continue this fight for marriage, which seems like it's costing us at the moment more than we're gaining out of it, like let's actually have a plan. And they come up with a 20-year strategy to win at the Supreme Court. The idea is to get there by 2025, and they use the sort of math of Loving v. Virginia, which when the Supreme Court in 1967 struck down state bans on interracial marriages, to look at what they thought the landscape would have to be in the states for judges to feel like they weren't getting out ahead of American society. And they refined the strategy once, but broadly what they want to do is they feel that aside from the legal merits of the case they're making, the court does not want to be in a position where it is seen as imposing something that is not already accepted by the American people, and has not shown some success in the political sphere. That if the courts just don't want to be seen imposing that. And I think that they're, we're very aware. I don't think anybody, thinks Brown v. Board was wrongly decided as a result, but I think they're acutely aware of the fact that we're 60 years later and 70 years later, and we still don't really know how to integrate schools, because in part because there was a lot of resistance to the school desegregation order. And so they come up with a set of goals that change a little bit over the years. But the idea is basically that they need to have marriage legal in a handful of states, that they want to have civil unions or domestic partnerships or some other recognition in a handful of states, and that they want to show eventually public opinion in polling is over 50% nationally, and want to demonstrate that they are not just getting these results through court orders, but that they are winning through legislatures and when this is put to a vote statewide. And by the time the first marriage cases come up in 2013, which is earlier than they had initially anticipated, they at least have some of each of those. And it requires a sort of different political focus. They're trying to move 9 people in robes in Washington, but they spend a lot of money advertising so that when, Justice Kennedy reads the paper and sees public opinion polling, he sees that, 52% of people in the country support this. Like, now I feel a weight lifted that I'm not going to go too far on this. And I think that this was a movement that started with lawyers and increasingly and ended with judges, but in between there were some really interesting interactions between the sort of legal strategy and the political strategy.
You mentioned 2004, and I wanted to push you on this a little bit because there is this, you allude to it being a sort of damaging myth among Democrats that the gay marriage ballot initiatives in 2004 were an important or maybe even determinative factor, or even that Karl Rove and the Bush campaign were the prime movers in putting those things on the ballot in order to drive evangelical turnout. Did you get to the bottom of that? To what degree do you think that affected the presidential election outcome in 2004?
So 2 separate questions. So one, I think that there is reason, there are political scientists who've studied this, who I think rather persuasively cast doubt on the evidence that this affected the presidential election results. A lot of it is focused on basically one exit poll finding in Ohio that that people have that suggests that African American support for Bush was unusually high there. So I think there's reason to be skeptical. This is a project for social scientists more than me, but I think there's a reason to be skeptical of the day after the election. Dianne Feinstein says that same-sex marriage is why John Kerry lost, and I think that 17 years later, people who've studied this are moving far away from that conclusion. On the bigger question, or sort of the question that I can have a better point of entry into, which is, was this a coordinated strategy to have this stuff on the ballot in to aid Bush, which definitely became some of the mythology pushed on both the right and the left. I think people on the right were happy that, exalting Karl Rove's genius, that he somehow, did this tricky stuff all over the country, and people on the left bought into it naturally. The reality is, I write about it, this sort of cadre of religious conservative, mostly evangelical activists called the Arlington Group, who spend all of 2003 and the beginning of 2004 trying in vain to get the Bush White House to care about marriage. And they totally fail. They think, their whole view of the Bush White House is that they're being taken for granted, that they played a central role in helping Bush win in 2000, that Bush got distracted by 9/11, that Bush and their lefty activists are saying this right now about Joe Biden. It's not a novel dynamic, but he's taking us for granted because he wants to win moderate suburbanites. And they spend 2003 basically scheming how they can get Bush and Rove to care as much about marriage as they do. First, it's the federal marriage amendment, the effort to amend the U.S. Constitution. It is only after Gavin Newsom basically decides unilaterally to start marrying couples in San Francisco, which Bush calls lawlessness, and that's why he now sort of reluctantly has to sign this constitutional amendment to stop the lawlessness. It's only then that Bush supports it, and it's only after the marriage amendment fails to get a supermajority in the Senate that summer that that these national organizations that had supported the federal amendment turn their attention to these state amendments. But it's actually pretty easy to look at the evidence and become skeptical of the kind of like Karl Rove did this thesis, in that you look at the 13 states that had ballot measures that fall, and only a couple of them were actual battlegrounds. Like Kentucky had one, which nobody was fighting over. Ohio and Michigan did, but most of the states were actually not states that Bush cared about winning. One of the states that he did care about winning, Missouri, had theirs in August in a summertime primary. I mean, the evidence just sort of fails on its face that this was designed. But I reconstructed sort of, the dynamic that between these conservative activists and the White House, and they never felt like the White House was really receptive to them, let alone like doing their bidding, because they had some shared common interest in this issue.
I do love that argument. This action is lawless, and that's why we have to make it illegal.
Yes.
I'm going to turn it over to Mark now. He's going to take your questions and relay them to Sasha.
Molly, thank you. Sasha, what a great conversation, and so timely in the sense of that we sit here in Pride Month in the state of Florida, which, by the way, still has on the books a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. And I'll mention that in a moment because I want to share with you a question that had come in. But I want to go back to Molly's original question, which was sort of, the impetus for the book. You obviously finished it in 2015. What have the last 6 years been like? And was there a desire to try to maybe do an epilogue in terms of that, or that's another opportunity?
So the news stopped in 2015, which for my purposes was good, that there was a clarity about where the main part of this story would end. But I actually expected that I would spend a lot more time. Molly asked a version of this about the sort of lack of backlash, or how it disappeared from our politics. I really thought, and had been scheming with my editors about a deadline with the expectation that I would be spending 2015 and 16 and who knows how long trying to chase the embers of this thing as it was fought out around the country. I mean, Molly mentioned Kim Davis, who, if you've forgotten, was the Kentucky County Clerk who for a little while in the summer of 2015 went to jail, or prison jail, I guess, out of a refusal to basically issue marriage licenses to gay couples. I was expecting after this Supreme Court decision that there would be hundreds of Kim Davises around the country, and that some of them would be state attorneys general or governors, that they would have the backing of some state Supreme Courts, that, it would not have surprised me if Barack Obama's Justice Department had to send U.S. Marshals into county courthouses to, I really expected, and I think a lot of that is having read about, Roe v. Wade, having read about Brown v. Board, and, landmark civil rights decisions that spur real organized backlash and aren't treated as settled. The other thing worth noting is I think in the history books, we're going to look back at June 2015 and look at two major events. June 26, 2015 is when the Supreme Court rules in Obergefell. June 15, 2015 is when Donald Trump announces he's running for president. Came down the escalator, as he likes to say. If you had told me in advance that the most gifted demagogue of our era, with a remarkable instinct for how to pit Americans against each other on various identity lines for his own amusement or political benefit or whatever, would announce he's running for president and come to dominate our political conversation in the same month that there was a landmark liberal court ruling that struck down basically red state bans on, something that people thought was a deeply held religious issue, I would have assumed those two things would be greatly related to one another, and that somebody like Donald Trump would find a way to make this a sort of central part of his political identity. And one of the curious things about Donald Trump is look back at that campaign, Muslims, women, immigrants from a variety of countries, Mexicans. He never really wanted to make an issue out of this. He never made gays, and his administration was not particularly friendly to trans folks, but he never wanted to make gays and lesbians who wanted to get married a target. And I think a big part of why there wasn't, if Donald Trump had decided with his sort of nose for issues that can split people to use this as something that would, I think, we'd be in a very different world in terms of what the fallout would be. So anyway, I thought I was going to be covering a lot more of that. I finished the book ultimately in early 2018. And the last 3 years have been, it's a very long book. So everything, editing, copy editing, fact checking, everything just takes longer. And then it was delayed for a year because of COVID. My publication date was pushed back 3 times. Wow. This was initially supposed to come out last Pride Month. Yeah, that's what I've been up to.
Well, gays are really good at waiting, so I will tell you it's perfectly fine, and we're thrilled that you're with us here tonight. You talk about, sort of where public sentiment is today, and I think, approaching something like 70% of folks who have been polled, just feel like it's not an issue. It's, a right. I have a lot of straight friends who say to me, we love that gays are getting married. They can be miserable just like us. And I think that's a little tongue-in-cheek. But at the end of the day, you talked about it in terms of the gold standard. And you write in one of your chapters about Governor Portman. And I'm a kid that grew up in Ohio, and so I keep an eye on what goes on there. But who, had been, before he was in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, and had, I think, even been a sponsor of the bill related to DOMA. And had a life-changing moment. I've seen this with other leaders where a child comes out, their child comes out. We saw it with our own representative here in Coral Gables, whose daughter is trans, and now her son, Rodrigo, with Ileana Ross-Layton. And so I do think those moments hit really close to home, but it's even around this issue of gay marriage. Were there any of those aha moments that you could see that thread being woven?
Yeah, I mean, so, one of the things that has always been the best predictor of individual support on gay rights issues, not just marriage, but basically is how people answer the survey question. Do you have a friend, a family member, or coworker who's gay or lesbian? And that question was first started being asked in the late 1970s. It was pretty close to 0 who said yes. Now it's pretty close to 100% who say yes. And some huge part of this story is, I have to presume, based on everything we know about heredity, that the percentage of people in the population who are gay or lesbian is basically the same as it was in the late 1970s. What's obviously different is that there are far more people who are out. And something that, in the sort of desire to compare and contrast this with previous movements for racial equality or for racial justice or for women's equality. It's worth noting that unlike race or sex, people control the conditions under which they acknowledge and disclose and announce that they are gay or lesbian. And some part of what we've lived through, right, is a cycle, and it's really hard to disentangle each of these elements, but it's pretty clear pop culture played some role in signaling, ahead of culture, ahead of sort of lived experience, acceptance of acknowledgement of same-sex families. People came out, that their immediate community, their families, their parents realized that they knew somebody who was gay or lesbian. I think they realized that the desire to be married was actually pretty basic and not that radical. It was arguably the least radical thing you could want in your life. And that made other people, that created a cultural climate in which other people felt comfortable coming out. And that just becomes a sort of virtuous cycle. And I think that, Portman wrote nicely about this. He gave an interview to CNN and wrote an op-ed, I think, for the Columbus Dispatch on the day that he announced his decision. And he was the first national Republican of any currently involved in politics to announce their support for same-sex marriage. And he, a lot of what he said, he tried to frame it in conservative terms, and he said that why should his son be denied the same thing that he and his wife had access to, and framed it not as, some sort of radical provocation to want to change the institution of marriage, but in these very kind of integrationist terms that exalted traditional marriage. And that's, I think, comes back to something else Molly and I were talking about. It just became very hard for people like, say, Rick Santorum to be arguing, with 50% of their mental energy that marriage was this special institution that brought stability and meaning to people's lives. And with the other 50% of their energy, we should deny people who we think are somehow troubled access to this institution that we think is the only source of stability in their lives. And it just became, I think, very hard rhetorically for conservatives to kind of keep straight what they were saying about why marriage was important.
I love that he used the term, this is Senator Portman, that it was a tribute to marriage versus being something that was unnatural.
I'm glad you pulled out that word. That's what I was sort of fishing.
I love that word, and I realize it's his word, but I want to share that because I think for a lot of people, it goes to the core of what you're writing about in the sense of a great history. Was there a particular interview that you did that was very emotional, painful, or someone recounting for you a particular experience? Because even though you talk about this 25, 30-year journey, you obviously have to go back further than that to really understand, sort of the, psyche of our country, if you will, the feelings, the mores of the time. I'm a kid that grew up in the late 60s through the 70s, and the closet was nailed shut, glued shut, and then, the handle was removed. So it was pretty frightening. There was no pathway to marriage. You just would be in what I call the Ernie and Bert situation, a long roommate situation,
Yeah, I don't know if it was painful, but I spent a lot of time with a couple from Hawaii that Molly's also written a little about. And so there where the book starts. Janora Dansel's the first character you meet. And she and her partner, Anania Bear, are one of the three couples that end up part of this PR stunt that ends up leading to the landmark decision before the Hawaii Supreme Court. And she was the shy one in this couple, Janora, and has talked plenty over the years about their relationship. But she was, in the closet to her family when she started this process, and not really out at work. There were not, legal protections for against employment discrimination. She worked in a very sort of macho workplace, and did not want her employees to know that she considered herself gay. It was a lot of interviews. I wanted to start this book before you get overwhelmed with lawyers and politicians and political strategists to, and before I showed the country kind of stumbling into this big conflict that overwhelmed us, to show this individual who sort of gets pulled into a political and legal conflict that she did not anticipate, plan for, ask for. And, it was a, there were a lot of conversations. I was really trying to just kind of get a sense of her thinking at the time, she says that she was 5 when she realized that there was something. She obviously didn't call herself a lesbian at the age of 5, but she said she was 5 when she recognized that there was something different about her. And, there's a moment you see where 3 months before they're involved in this sort of PR stunt to request marriage licenses, Janora buys a ring for Nania and proposes to her, but proposing doesn't mean anything in a legal sense. And so, trying to reconstruct that conversation from both of their ends to really get at what did you think you were asking her in this moment? What did you expect? It was clearly a real meaningful moment for each of you to share. But it did not have the obvious legal meaning that it does when two people who can legally marry propose to one another. So those interviews were were, emotionally, and like Molly, I'm a political reporter. I talk to people about their lives. I've done relatively little talking to people about their sexual or romantic lives. It's just a sort of matter of my reporting toolkit. So, there were a few things that pushed me a little bit out of my comfort zone. Talking to judges about the complexities of appellate procedure was one, and then talking to people about their feelings was the other.
I like that. And Molly, you've written about the same couple. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking back to, so I got to know Ninia and Janora for a piece that I did back in 2015, and they had come to DC for the Obergefell decision, and so I took them out to dinner at the Tabard Inn, and who should be at the next table? I noticed halfway through, but Valerie Jarrett and Kathleen Sebelius, who at the time is the Health and Human Services Secretary. And so I just sort of couldn't resist. I as we were leaving the restaurant, stopped by their table and said, I don't know if you know who these two women are, but and at this point they had already become sort of mini celebrities, particularly in gay rights and litigation circles. And it was so funny for this issue that everyone knows it was sort of an orphan issue that was this lonely torch that was carried for so long. And here are these two women who started this improbable battle back in the 90s. And in 2015, two of the most powerful people in the American government are just gushing over them and saying, oh my gosh, we admire you so much. You're such heroes. It's such an honor to meet you. It was just such a funny illustration of how full circle the issue had come and entered the mainstream.
No, thank you for sharing that too. And Sasha, going back to your research, I mean, the book is incredibly annotated, which I think for anybody that wants to go and dig even deeper than you did, it's right there for them to look at. And that's one of the things that I marvel at, because this was a journey for you, and then the process after you finished writing, and then the delay. What are you working on now?
There's a historic election fraud scandal that I've sort of stumbled into being fascinated with from a little over 100 years ago in Indiana that I'm hoping is a very good historic true crime yarn that has some interesting resonances with our current moment. So I've promised everybody in my life that it'll be shorter than this book and take me less time to finish than this book.
I love that. Have you ever been to Indiana?
I have. I made 2 reporting trips there. Is there some Ohio bias that's going to show in a second?
Listen, Ohio has a lot of bias. We want to punch above our weight and everything. We get a little annoyed with Michigan. Indiana, we joke about because they never know what time it is there because they're on Central Time Zone. But some areas don't do daylight savings, some do. So you could be within like a 12-block radius, and it could be 3 different hours. Okay. It could be tomorrow for all you know.
So I'm hoping that's the next thing. I've been waiting.
Very cool. And I love the parallel to what we're obviously is in the, the daily conversation here. I mean, you can't turn on a media outlet and we're still not, talking about, whatever is left over and hung over from that. Molly, a final word or a thought or something that popped up, and I want to be cognizant that we're right at almost 8 o'clock hour.
Well, for the record, I definitely think Ohio is superior to Indiana, and I don't care who knows it. Not just because of the time zone issue. Well, Sasha, why don't you leave us with some parting thoughts?
First of all, thank you guys for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. What I wanted to do, this is something that, unless you have like a lot of 9-year-olds who tune into Books and Books chats about works of nonfiction, everybody has lived through some significant part of this story. And sure. I think that I can sort of promise everybody who picks it up that there will be large parts of it that are entirely new to you. And then you will find things that you remember, and you will see them from a new perspective and get an understanding of what happened that led to those events, and what the fallout was that will be new to you. And so, I sort of hope that it is, a reading experience for people that is at once incredibly eye-opening, but also in a certain way familiar, and contextualizes a lot of things that you probably have from your memories, but don't certainly don't have the full story.
No, and I appreciate that. And, one of the things that I can tell you that the book has done for me is that I went back as part of my preparation today to look at sort of how that constitutional amendment came about. And I had completely forgotten that it was in 2008.
The Florida one
the Florida Constitutional Amendment. 2008, 62% of Floridians voted to make that a constitutional amendment, while at the same time cast a vote for the first African-American president in the history of our country. So, Florida has always been a little bit, wonky in terms of even its political sort of leanings. But that's
I'm here in California, which doesn't consider itself wonky in the way Florida does. And that same day, November 2008, by a smaller margin, passed Proposition 8 at the same time that Barack Obama was winning overwhelmingly. And I think there are a lot of moments in the story where some version of wow, we've come a long way in a short period of time will sort of strike people.
No, and I think out of the Supreme Court's decision, other things in Florida have then been discussed. I mean, it's just recently that we have put protections in terms of employment here at the state level. And I work in a chamber of commerce, so we are all about our companies and workforce. And, at the end of the day, we were not being competitive as a state because folks are like, why would I relocate there? Even going back to, I remember the president of Wells Fargo came to Florida from California. And at the time, her marriage to a woman was recognized. That was before Prop 8 in California. And she told me tooth and nail about having to come to Florida to work because Wells Fargo was taking over for all of Wachovia. And she says, because I've moved to a place where my marriage is not only recognized, it's vilified. And that, if nothing sobers you up in a quick moment of a senior leading executive who's been relocated here and looks at Florida in that way, how is the rest of the country and the world? And, we're just one of the 50 states. But now, since then, obviously, now Florida is the third largest state, $1 trillion economy, and needs folks who come here because they have not only those protections, but want to be in Florida and be part of our workforce. So we see it from our perspective in a lot of ways, and not just being a gay man, but somebody who, appreciates what work you have done because I can find it now in one place.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an honor to have you with us here. Make it a great Pride Month. And don't forget, you can pick up Sasha's book at Books and Books. And you don't even have to leave the comfort of your home. You can push that little green button right below Sasha, Molly, and myself, and you can support locally, independently owned businesses like Books and Books, a great community collaborator and convener. And today is a great example, again, of having discussions around essential issues, not only during Pride Month, but throughout the year. So everybody, make it a great night. Head on out, be safe, and continue to support local business.